So we need to be very clear that you're not going to get gun deaths to zero. It will not happen.
Right.
You can significantly reduce them through having more fathers in the home,
Yes.
by having more armed guards in front of schools. We should have an honest and clear reductionist view of gun violence, but we should not have a utopian one. You will never live in a society when you have an armed citizenry and you won't have a single gun death. That is nonsense. It's drivel. Wow. But I think it's worth it. I think it's worth to have a cost of, unfortunately, some gun deaths every single year so that we can have the Second Amendment to protect our other God-given rights. That is a prudent deal. It is rational. Nobody talks like this. They live in a complete alternate universe.
Hello, and welcome to another brand new episode of Lucky Paper Radio. My name is Andy, and I'm here once again, as always, with my co-host, Anthony. It's pick one. He gets 2 picks, and he's taking both Farmstead Gleaner and Pathway Arrows Maddox.
That's the dream. That's all I ever want to do in the Turbo Cube.
Is there not a more contemporary, is there like a 2-card combo that you think is more recent in your life? I feel like the old 2-card combo is White Mane Lion and the thing.
The thing. Catcher's Monument?
Catcher's Monument. That's like the first 2-card combo that you were like putting in cubes. Now it's Farmstead Gleaner, Pathway Arrows.
I mean, that's a 2-card combo that only functions in the Turbo Cube, so that's kind of a special case. I don't know, I feel like I drafted Stoneforge Mystic and Batterskull for literally the first time ever, like in a way that just worked really well this last week at our Cube Night. That's my combo of the week.
But that's not emblematic of you and your play style and cube design style, though. That's very like Power Max pilled. You're like Farmstead Gleaner and Pathway Arrows pilled.
It's fun to have a big scarecrow. I mean, I just like the narrative of the scarecrow just like shooting out arrows. Meanwhile,
shaking back and forth really
growing
quickly
to tremendous size, and everything around it is dying. And then you attack with it.
Yeah, is that the win condition? You just attack with it after you shoot everything?
After you kill everything.
It's cool that that's how you actually win, is by attacking with the big scarecrow. I don't know. I think it's kind of dumb that like a lot of the Walking Ballistic combos, you don't even bother attacking. You just make it real big and then shoot your opponent. Boring. Got to swing with the big scarecrow. That's the way to do it. Anthony, in this week's episode, I thought we should talk about Pick 2 Draft, which we are kind of pretty disconnected from the churn of Magic news and new sets. I think it's safe to say you and I probably know next to nothing about Spooderman and the Spooderman cards, but I do know that there is a new draft format that they are revealing with this set that they may try in the future again for other small sets. It is a small set with fewer cards in it, fewer unique cards, and so I think it's part of the reason why is designed instead of being drafted at a normal 8-seat table with 15 card packs where you get 1 pick per pack. It is instead meant to be drafted with 4 players, same booster packs, but you get 2 picks per pack. And that's just the draft format they are sort of pioneering.
I would make one correction based on my understanding, and you're right, I'm not super connected with what's happening in the Spider-Man set, but in Gavin's sort of explanatory video about it, he didn't say it's replacing 8-person draft, but it's just another alternative, which I think makes a lot of sense. I think that something they're dealing with all these crossover sets is they're reaching pretty new audiences, and those audiences don't necessarily have easy access to, either maybe an LGS that's firing a regular 8-person draft night, or easy access to 7 other friends to host their own 8-player draft with. So trying to find ways to make it make sense to this newer, less enfranchised audience is a problem that I get why they're facing that.
My understanding, maybe you know this better than I do, is this not the draft format that you'll basically be playing on Arena and MTGO for this format, though?
Oh, you know what? That is one thing I know about the Spider-Man set, is it is totally messed up on Arena because they aren't allowed to use any of the Spider-Man
but the set is there. It's just everybody's like a lady who likes spiders and whatever.
Yeah, spider person. I don't know. I have no idea.
I thought it was the draft format for this set in all venues, and also the one they were encouraging people to do with all their LGSs. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but either way, it is definitely a draft format that WotC has officially ordained, and I think us as cube designers who are used to playing draft with lots of different sizes of people are probably now anybody that's coming from outside the cube world is going to kind of assume this is the correct or like proper way to draft with 4 people. And I thought we should talk about that idea because I think you and I probably both agree this is not the best way to draft with 4 people. If your goal was just to have a good draft, right? Obviously, Wizards of the Coast has a lot of other considerations. I think, frankly, just making this as simple as possible so you can explain it is probably one of their biggest priorities, right? And so the name just explains the whole thing. There's nothing else changed about it. 4 players pick 2, right? That's the whole thing. So I'm not saying that anything that Wizards did is wrong or, short-sighted or whatever, but I do think it's kind of not a great way to draft with 4 people if like replayability and like just the quality of the draft is one of your priorities. I think we should talk about why, and then also maybe talk about if you're going to design a cube where you are going to be embracing this draft format, what you might do differently, or what they may have done, honestly, in this set to design for Pick 2 specifically.
I think you're right. That simplicity, I think, is so key. Gavin also just mentioned, they spent a lot of time testing out different alternative ways to draft with smaller groups, which obviously is something that as cube players we've talked about and done a lot of. But thinking about like, okay, well, what if I had to start with sealed booster packs? How would I approach this a little bit differently? Because you don't necessarily have the same flexibility you do with a cube.
Yeah.
And all the other options I was thinking through, it's like, well, does it make sense to explain to people like, okay, first open up all the boosters and then like deal them out into different size packs, or like set aside the rares and collate them in a new way? Like, no, none of that is possible to just like explain to somebody in a 2-minute video or just the title of the draft format. So yeah, it really is just such an easy to explain and communicate thing, which I think does solve a lot of the issues with just scaling down a draft to 4 players.
Yeah, I think if you're doing it with sealed product and it's trying to be simple, it's probably the thing I would have decided was correct too, right? Like, all these other formats we're going to talk about are going to have other considerations. They're going to require more cards. They are going to be in some format that is not conducive to 15-card packs. They're going to be, just formats that make a lot of sense for drafting for 4 people if you do have a cube or whatever, but is not what I would choose if I was officially deciding, from Wizards of the Coast perspective, what the 4-player draft format ought to be. Again, none of this is a criticism of any of that. This is just purely us talking from like a game design perspective about what Pick 2 draft does to the game of drafting, because you and I both love drafting. Drafting is a huge part of why we love Cube.
It's almost the fun part. I think about all the time still, the one time that we're sitting down and one of our friends is just like, yeah, well, they have Arena totally backwards. This was when there wasn't drafting, or there was only bot drafting at the time. And he's like, this sucks. Like, I just want to do the draft and then have bots play the games and figure out if I drafted good and just like keep drafting. I'm like, yeah, I don't know if my opinion is quite as extreme, but I see where you're coming from. I do think you're also correct that even though like we have so much flexibility in cube drafts, whatever Wizards does is just going to have a huge effect on that broader community and that broader approach. So I agree that we will see a lot of this happening in Cube, and especially for newer players coming into Cube. I feel like we saw this a lot with the Commander draft formats, where as soon as they made a product, that became the way that Commander cubes were so often built and drafted, for better or for worse. And I think you're right that we'll see that as well here.
Was that very similar to Pick 2 draft, the Commander Legends draft format?
It was, which is an interesting point. They had both bigger booster packs. They were 20-card booster packs. You did double picks because they didn't want that 20-card pack wheeling around forever, and then building 60-card decks, which is, it's all...
That's a lot.
Yeah.
I think we should start by talking about just what maybe the shortcomings are of this Pick 2 draft format with 4 players. For people that haven't thought about the game design considerations of a draft, it might not be obvious why this potentially has some shortcomings, but I think it really does. And the first and biggest one for me is that I think signals are going to be near impossible to read at a Pick 2 table in a way that I think is going to really not reward like finding the open lane in the same way as you get rewarded in a normal typical draft. Does that sound right to you, or do you think that's off base?
It's an interesting question, and I honestly could see it going either way depending on the sort of strategies and personalities of the players that you're drafting with. They were actually talking about this Pick 2 format on Good Luck High Five last week, and they emphasized very clearly that they thought reading signals was much, much easier. And I think that if you're playing with people that are just really willing to jump into a lane and commit to it, that's maybe true. Or you'll see signals sooner because players are taking twice as many cards out. So if somebody is just like, I'm just going to take all the red cards, you will see a pack with no red cards in it in your second pick. Whereas if you were just taking one card at a time, you wouldn't see that as soon. However, I wonder what your strategy would be, like your personal strategy going into a Pick 2 draft would be, and I think it's much more likely that you would hedge your bets and like just take the 2 best cards, regardless of what colors they were in, and not try and sort of force a color as aggressively from the beginning.
That would be my initial strategy out of the gate, would be just to take the best cards. And it's worth noting, like, you're taking double picks, but you're still only drafting 3 packs, and you're still only building 1 deck. So you're still getting the same size pool, you're just getting it in bigger chunks, basically, which is different than, if you were taking 2 picks, like in the Commander Legends draft, and getting more cards because of it, but you're still, getting the same number of cards just in bigger chunks.
I think that's a really good way to phrase it, and actually helps me think about it a little bit better, where, yeah, you're still trying to read the same signal, but you're reading it in fewer increments of bigger chunks of cards. So my concern as a player is, am I just going to end up, if I do try and like commit hard to, I'm going to just grab one color, if somebody else at the table, and also we're talking about a smaller table of just 4 players probably, where if one other person or 2 other people also pick up on that same color, I'm potentially going to be much more punished for starting in a lane that ends up not being open. It is sort of a funny thing where you could say like, okay, well, I can read the signal much quicker in terms of number of picks, but if I instead just sort of like put the 2 drafts on a scale of number of cards, it actually might just be a little bit less flexible, and I have fewer sort of decision points in order to pivot and get sort of like incremental knowledge and navigate that decision space. Instead, it's just like big chunk, big chunk, big chunk. And it is a big chunk. It's like half of the decisions, or it's maybe difficult to phrase it as half of the decisions because obviously you're still making all of the choices of the number of cards you're picking, but the opportunities to read signals is half as many.
Maybe the better place to start is just with how 4 decks and compared to 8 decks is going to be different when you're drafting and picking an entire pool of cards, right? We'll talk in a second here about how some of these other draft formats address these issues, and mostly they do it by having chunks of cards you don't end up drafting, that you either burn or you ignore or you put back in, Housman packs, or you don't pick up in a grid draft. In this format, you're opening every single card and someone's drafting every single card you're taking. Magic is still largely built, and I can't speak to the Spider-Man set because I literally have no idea. I've barely looked at the cards, but heuristics for Limited are built on the idea of a 2-color deck for the most part, right? And if there are 10 2-color combinations, and obviously certain formats really only support a couple subsets of those, but if there are 10 2-color combinations and you only have 4 decks at the table, then there's going to be a ton of, especially gold cards, that no one's going to want, that are just going to get super late. And so I think one of the sort of shortcomings I see of this draft format is that I expect many colored decks to be strongly favored, because if you are the only player at the table that is willing to take and try and play some of those other gold cards that are, splashes for you, that's going to be a lot of powerful cards you're going to get for free, and you can instead spend your time prioritizing fixing and whatnot. And again, I cannot speak to the Spider-Man set at all. I can speak to how this draft format, which I have done, will work at most cubes, for example. And I think one of the things you'll find is that compared to a regular 8-player table, you're going to really find very soupy decks that are not very focused, that are playing many colors, just kind of a pile of good cards, and not sort of leaning into one particular strategy.
I don't know if I totally agree with that, because I think, again, it depends on sort of what the fastest deck at the table looks like, and I think you can still have a very fast deck in this kind of draft format.
But here's the thing. You are opening half as many cards for that deck at the table.
That's a good point.
It's so much harder to have a really good aggro deck at a table where you're only opening half as many packs, because that's fewer opportunities for you to get the cards to make your curve fill out exactly right, for you to get the power outliers for your color combination, right? Like, how many red, white, gold cards are opened at an 8-player table? You're going to open half as many at a 4-player table. So if you're just committed to red, white, you are not getting paid off for finding that open land as much as you are at a much bigger table, which I think applies not just to aggro, but any focused deck. It is much harder to be, a focused thematic or, synergistic deck of any kind at a table where the pool of cards is half the size.
That's a good point, and I think that maybe that also does tie into how you might design the cube a little bit differently. The thing that you said that I really do agree with is that even though you're scaling down to 4 players, you might still have like a similar representation of the number of colors that people are playing. It's like, okay, you and I are maybe sharing a color, and I'm sharing a different color with the person sitting next to me, and it still kind of balances out evenly. But what will not necessarily be evenly represented, if players are still playing 2-color decks, is the number of combinations that are represented.
Correct.
And I think that makes a huge difference, where, in theory, let's imagine you have an 8-player draft and everybody's playing a 2-color deck. A lot of people will be sharing individual colors, but not necessarily sharing the combinations. So you'll have 7, maybe 8 of those different combinations represented. So any 2-color card has a home somewhere at the table. If you're playing with only 4 players, it is much less likely. And we can see sort of cascade into the design of the set as well, where there are fewer gold cards. I think all the gold cards are just within the 5 allied pairs. So they've just said, like, yeah, just ignore these particular color pairs. And then they've also added a bunch of hybrid cards. And I think all of those go together to sort of support the fact that any monocolored card still is equally playable when you have 4 players, but multicolored cards get more difficult.
Yeah, I mean, we'll get to our sort of tips for designing an environment around this draft format later, but my first tip, frankly, is just start with no gold cards. Do none. I genuinely think that, having any even remotely powerful cards in any given 2-color combination, if you want to encourage your players to play like relatively typical limited decks, any 2-color combination is much more likely to not be drafted at a given 4-player table than to be drafted. And so that's just either a ton of wasted slots, right? Tons of unplayable cards your players are just going to get last pick that are in off colors. Or more realistically, it's going to encourage players to break from your sort of idea of what 2-color decks ought to do and, ought to look like, and instead just say, well, I'm going to play 4 colors, and I'm just going to play a pile of good cards and fixing and hope it all works out.
It could definitely pan out that way. I feel like I just want to do your impression of me from last week. Well, it depends on the
you listened to it.
I mean, I would just say, like, anything that we say as a guideline, obviously, don't be too absolute. And if you're like, hey, I just think like these 4 gold cards are super sick and I want to put them in, do it. Whatever. It doesn't matter.
Look, the ultimate cube design rule is do whatever you want and think is cool. But if you are listening to this because you're like, I want to make a pick 2 cube that is going to be playable and, support my goals, without knowing your goals, the first thing I can suggest is that compared to a regular cube, I think gold cards are going to behave dramatically differently. And also, honestly, I kind of like cubes without gold cards. This was true of the Alpha Reimagined cube that we handpicked to be included at CubeCon last year. It was a cube with no gold cards because there were no gold cards in Alpha, and it actually feels sick. I think it feels really good, and the way that it changes how you have to like read draft signals, like really reading draft signals. What a lot of players mean when they say reading draft signals is I saw a gold card mid-pack. There, I read a signal. And it's like...
I think that counts. That counts as reading a signal. It doesn't have to be complicated.
It does, but I think it is kind of... it's kind of like the bluntest, dumbest signal to possibly read. Like, yeah, you saw a gold card.
Start there. Those are the ones that are easy to talk about. There's nothing wrong with that.
It's fine. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with it. I'm just saying there's a lot of interesting depth to be pursued if you are, instead of reading signals on just like, I saw the, 2-color gold card. I know that no one's drafting that 2-color pair. If you instead see not just blue cards, but blue cards that all sort of lean towards this particular tempo of deck, and you can start to sort of understand what strategies might be open at the table, not just what particular color pairs. So yeah, I think gold cards are going to behave very differently, and I think you will have to work uphill to combat the soupiness that you're going to get from a 4-player draft format where you specifically, every card you open ends up in somebody's pool.
Right. I think that I would put the soupiness and the potential for unplayed gold cards that just don't have a home in kind of the same category, where depending on the relative power level of those gold cards and the overall speed of the format, it can go either way, but there is a risk of one of those two things that is probably undesirable.
I think you have to make the gold cards pretty bad before the optimal strategy would be to play soupy decks.
We could do that.
And I think you would have some players. I think you would have some players that would commit to the bit, and they would just not do that because they're like, oh, I don't have enough fixing, so I'll just play 2 colors, and then just get absolutely owned by somebody who's playing 3-3-3, of different basics and just, bombs in the gold colors. Unless your gold cards are literally not better than your monocolored cards, at which point, why are they there in the first place, I guess.
But just to be clear, this sort of question about the way gold cards play differently applies to any kind of 4-player draft, right? It's not specific to the pick 2 draft, or you think it does?
It applies to any 4-player draft where you must end up with every card open in someone's pool. It does not, because lots of 4-player draft formats that we prefer, there are specifically a bunch of cards that are not drafted by anybody. And that is how you have an opportunity to have whole archetypes that are in the cube that do not reward the greedy 4 or 5 color player by just giving them last pick gold cards, and instead just get burned or get ignored in grid drafts or get, returned to the pile in Housman drafts. And we'll talk about other draft formats and check the timestamp if you want to jump to that. But no, I think this applies to any 4-player draft format where specifically every card you open ends up in somebody's pool. And it's hard for me to imagine a draft format where those things are true and this dynamic would not be at play.
I think sort of a related thing to that is sort of the thinking about archetypes. I think that very often, because this is the way limited sets are, if not designed, at least presented, is sort of almost always based on hey, every color pair has some kind of mechanical identity, some kind of archetype to it. And similar to all the different gold color pairs not being represented in a 4-player draft, that's true of the archetypes as well. And so I think if you're trying to design in a way where there are super specific, super clear, well-defined archetypes that have very specific cards dedicated to just one spot, that's also going to be a similar situation where some of those cards just won't make sense because they mechanically don't have enough density or there's not enough players at the table to support that. And I think that a similar solution makes sense of just focus on the monocolors, and then the combinations of the monocolors will naturally sort of lend themselves to different strategies anyway. And so,
which is kind of how you and I like to design cubes anyway.
Definitely, I think that's true.
I think a lot of people really like having that sort of prescriptive, the first thing I do is pick my 10 themes, and then I sort of pick cards for those themes. Whereas I think you and I both kind of have a slight preference for just playing cards that we like and are interesting and I think are going to contribute to play patterns that we enjoy, and then seeing how they are combined with other cards sort of on the fly and emergently.
One of my favorite things about the game is the way that the colors each have their own identity and you put them together and they do different stuff. It's like, okay, cool. I have red and white. They're both pretty aggressive. They'll play aggressive together. I have green that has ramp and blue that has card advantage. Those will pair together in a way that's very natural, and sort of a strategy emerges from that, which is different from if I take that green and pair with red, which has efficient removal. And now it's a more proactive, like what people might call the stompy deck. It's like, yeah, that's just what the color pie does.
Man, the color pie is so great.
Good job, Richard.
We love the color pie. So I think we're sort of landing on the idea that most of the game design challenges of a pick-2 format are actually really related to the size of the draft, the 4 players, and the fact that we are drafting every card in that we open, and not necessarily the actual pick-2. How do you think picking 2 at a time actually changes the texture of things?
I don't know. I feel like I'm sort of stuck in just an aesthetic preference toward picking 1 card at a time because it's just so natural and so incremental. And like the atomic unit of the game is a card, and I pick 1 card at a time, and it gives you that sort of highest resolution of number of decisions to navigate through the draft. I feel also just like some anxiety about like, what's my strategy going into a pick 2 draft? Do I want to try and just take 2 cards of the same color and really try and send a strong signal? Or do I want to stay more open and just, for the first couple of picks, just take the best cards? To me, it just isn't quite as fun or satisfying. And while on one hand, I think that some people will say like, oh, but aren't you always in that situation where there's just 2 cards you really want out of a pack? This kind of draft format solves that by allowing you to pick 2 cards at once. And it's like, yeah, you've kind of solved the problem, but you've also just kicked the can down the road, and it maybe wasn't really a problem at all, because that like tension and that like
maybe
need to make a choice is what makes it a fun game. And if you kind of take that to its absurd conclusion of, well, then you're just playing sealed decks, and that's not necessarily fun either. Like, I like drafting.
Wow,
and
sealed draft.
Now, sealed is good too, but it's a different
we know where Anthony's putting
thing.
sealed in the FMK sealed draft cube experience.
Sealed draft cube?
Don't worry about it.
Okay,
There's a dumb intro from a couple weeks ago that doesn't matter.
Must have missed that one.
I didn't even make it. I just stole it from Loading Ready Run. Don't worry about it.
Okay.
It's genuinely not worth thinking about. I should say, like, I think if you are going to draft whole pools with 4 players, I would still do it pick 2. I think a pack wheeling around the table 3 to 4 times is a bummer. So I would probably still maintain this rule. I think it's kind of strange to like have a pack going around a whole bunch. I do agree that it feels like a novelty to players that are used to taking 1 card, and so for that reason, might for a little while feel like I get to have my cake and eat it too. The
first couple times it does feel like, ooh, that situation I'm used to being in of I can't take both these cards. Now I've solved it.
I get to both take my fixing land and also this bomb in my colors. I don't have to like commit to just one or the other. And I do think that over time, when it's no longer novel, like if you were to introduce somebody to drafting a priori and never done either method of drafting, they wouldn't have that thought. They wouldn't be like, oh, I get to take both these cards. It would just be a different thing because they're not used to having that sort of tension that we're all used to from taking 1 card out of a pack. I do think it gives you in some ways, like you said, there are fewer decisions by raw numbers. Or, I mean, I guess it depends if you're taking each pick as 1 decision or 2 decisions because you're still taking 2 cards out of the pack. But it's like fewer decision points. It's fewer like opportunities for new information before you get to make a decision, right?
Yeah, we know what we're talking about. Don't be pedantic about it.
We all know what we're talking about here. I do think that if you play that out to its extreme, you do wind up at sealed. And I do think that we are one little step down the road to sealed by basically saying, well, instead of making 45 individual 1-card picks. So I actually looked this up. The play boosters now actually only have 14 playable cards, and then the 15th one is a token or whatever. They're actually not talking about 45 card pools. They're talking about 42 card pools. And so now instead of 42 individual picks for your deck, you are instead making 21 double picks. Does that make sense? Why is that? But 21 that's divisible by 3
times.
7. Yeah, it's divisible by 3. Math is hard.
21, not prime.
You're making 21 double picks instead, and I think what that does offer you is this illusion maybe of more control over your draft because you're getting to like make multiple decisions at a time, but then you're also getting fewer of those decision points. So, we have all been in that one pack where it's no card for me in this pack, and you're going to have a pack where there's no card for you and you have to get 2 cards out of it, and that's going to feel extra bad because now you're sort of 2 cards fewer in your deck.
Or I think what happens more often is you'll say, oh, there's 1 card that's a slam dunk. I don't really know about what the second pick is. And I think that will just happen often enough that eventually that novelty will wear off.
And I'm curious to see once the 17 land sickos, if in fact this is the draft format on Arena and Magic Online, which I think it is based on what I've been hearing people talk about. Maybe I'm wrong. Once that sort of dust settles, I'm really curious to see what their like absolute sicko spikes think is the correct strategy. It's going to be one of the two extremes. It's going to be either you're just supposed to take the best card regardless of color in your first 6 picks, right? Because you can take whatever cards you want and you're like always hedging between all these different colors. And you're going to get more chances to take more power outliers because, again, you're only going to see packs half as many times. And so it's kind of like having twice as many first picks in that sense. And so you won't have to pass color outliers that are maybe splashes. You can afford to take a playable card for your deck. And also this huge bomb that is in a color you might end up splashing for, right? It's either going to be that you're supposed to just like hedge your bets completely, or it's going to be what you said, which is just like if your first pack has 2 really strong red cards, you just absolutely cut red because you can afford to cut it out of every pack from here on out, basically.
We call that doing a Joe Anderson.
And hope that no one passing to you is doing the same thing. And if they are, then you got to sort of pivot. But I think that we're probably going to land on a more like universally accepted best approach to drafting with pick 2 than we ever will with pick 1 draft, right? Like people will debate to the end of time about, you know, whether you're supposed to stay open or read signals or sort of commit. And that's all different depending on the set and depending on the cube you're playing. And I just think with this format, I'm not sure what it is yet because I'm not a psychopath sicko and I've only done this a couple times with cubes, but I do think we're going to settle on like, you should probably do one of these 2 things. And I frankly think it's going to be the first one because I think you're probably going to be correct playing many colors in a draft format like this. So you want many rares, you want many power outliers in those colors.
Or does it just give you so much opportunity to say, like, I'm just taking lands for my first bunch of picks, and then that'll leave me less vulnerable to not being able to read signals as well?
Well, I think you do both. I think you just consider lands power outliers.
Sure.
And so
okay.
You take, you know, power outliers in any color, and you take fixing lands, and then you're going to get last pick gold cards that nobody's playing because nobody's in that color combination, and you have already taken the fixing lands to make those cards playable in your deck. And then you're just off to the races of 5-color good stuff.
Right. So is it fair to say that I think we're both on the same page that double picks is potentially a good solution to this problem of, you know, we have sealed booster packs of a fixed size. How do we have an easy to communicate way to solve that issue of just having the same pack wheel around for days and just be like, oh God, this pack again, there's still nothing for me. So it's a reasonable solution to that. I think we agree it's not actually an improvement in terms of the gameplay because picking one card at a time is just like so natural and reasonable. And yeah, it gives you the most opportunities for correcting and navigating the draft that cutting out some of those decision points isn't necessarily actually more fun, despite those moments of novelty of like, perfect, I get the 2 cards I want.
Yeah, I don't think it's a coincidence that none of the draft formats that fans made that I'm aware of for cubes ever involve double picks. Can you think of a single one?
I mean, there's like infinite variations of sort of burn drafts for 2 players, and a lot of those do involve double picks. So where it's like, okay, I pick 1 card, and then I pick 2 cards, and then I burn a card. You know, those kinds of styles of things.
Yeah, those ones will do it. Sometimes have different pick sizes.
I also, personally, do not enjoy those drafts that much.
Burn drafts are some of my least favorite.
Especially when you're burning in the middle of a pack, I find really not so fun.
They're not my favorite either. I'm not aware of any other fan-made draft format where it's just like every pick is double picks because I think you come up with the question of why? Is there another way we can solve this problem? And the answer is if you're not constrained to 15-card booster packs and 3 booster packs per player, there's a lot of better ways to solve that problem than just saying everyone take 2 cards every time, you know?
I mean, some people I know just have made cubes that the intention was make all double picks, which, again, I feel like is kind of a fun novelty. I guess another question, because this is something else I talked about in presenting this format, is speed, like the actual logistics of sitting down and drafting. The claim is it goes much quicker just in terms of the time you're spending drafting.
I'm sure it does. Do you doubt that?
I doubt it just because I see myself being the problem, agonizing over double picks.
I think it's just, even if you spend the same amount of time in picks, you just have to account for the fact that there is half as much time spent with like
a pack sitting between people.
Waiting for the person to pick up the pack you're passing to, or waiting for someone to pass you a pack. You're just like cutting all that time out or in half completely. And so even if you spend just as much time agonizing over your picks, it's just so much fewer passes. I think it will go a lot faster.
I think that's probably true. I mean, is that something that you think about? Do you feel ever like the time it takes to draft is a big constraint you want to fight against, or do you think that's an issue that other people face?
No, I don't think so. I think with fewer players, drafts tend to take less time just because you have fewer people to be the one that holds everything up, right?
Yeah.
You know, every additional person is one additional person that could be the one agonizing over a pick and slowing the whole table down. And so even the 4-player draft formats that are like comparatively time intensive, they might take as long as an 8-player draft, but that doesn't feel long to people because that's how long they're used to taking to draft a deck. And so even if it's a like comparatively slow draft format for 4 people because it's taking effectively twice as long, it still feels like a normal draft length for people. And so I have not found that to be a problem with the draft formats I've ever experimented with, that like the draft takes too long.
Yeah, that's been my experience as well.
I guess I should say fact or fiction draft. It takes too long. Don't ever do that. But that's the 2-player draft format where every pick is a fact or fiction pile.
How about 2-player asynchronous rotisserie draft? That would take the longest.
Okay, roto takes a long time. That is true. Actually, 2 players probably takes less time than 8 players because, again,
the chance that you have this somebody who's in the middle of, a weekend trip in the woods.
Yep. So what are our favorite ways to draft with 4 players with our cubes? You go first.
So I want to start with maybe not my favorite way, but what I think is like the easiest way logistically is just to change the pack size. And I think that this is something that obviously is much more difficult for Wizards of the Coast to change, which is why I think they sort of like started with, this is the fixed point. How do we make this work with our 14-card boosters? But with a cube draft, you can do whatever you want. And I think just dealing out, what do we usually do? 5 packs of 9 or 4 packs of 11 works pretty well with, 4 or 6 players. Because it does solve that situation of just like having the same pack wheel and wheel again in a different way that I think is very easy to manage when you're dealing out packs anyway.
We do this a lot with 6 players. Like when we end up with a team draft, we'll very often do 4 packs of 11, basically for 6 players. I'm not sure I've ever seen us just do different pack sizes and no other modifications to a draft for 4 players, because I think you run up against the same problem. You're still drafting the full pool. And so what I have seen is like keep the same pack size, but do 4 packs and burn the last 4 cards out of the pack or whatever, or something. Like once you get to the last 4, you just get rid of them. And then you're also solving the wheeling problem because you've essentially made the pack size smaller, but the way you've made it smaller allows for more selection amongst the draft pool, which solves a lot of these problems of like, all right, now the gold cards that would otherwise just be last picks for the greedy 5-color player just get burned. They just, no one gets to see them. The strategies no one is drafting are not like clogging up everyone's pools. They're just not making it to pools at all.
Yeah. I mean, I did a lot of both of those styles of drafts, both when we were new at Cube and growing our Cube group initially, and then we were growing the weekly Cube night. We just had a lot of small groups. And so, we did a lot of small packs for 4 players and more packs or burning at the end of the draft. And those are easy numbers for you to tweak, do it 1 week, see how it feels. If you're like, well, the last, 4 packs still just kind of felt like a drag in each pack, then try just burning a few cards at the end of each pack. And by burning, just to be absolutely clear, we just mean take those last 4 cards, those last 3 cards, whatever you want it to be, and just set them aside in a face down pile, and everybody do the same thing and just ignore those. Those are then just not part of the draft and not part of anyone's pool.
Yeah, and that is my preferred way to burn draft, is just decide how many cards you want people to get out of the pack and then have them burn the remainder at the end, rather than a lot of formats which require you to like pick one, burn one. And doing that, I think just our experience has always been that it devolves to like, well, everyone's just making everyone's deck worse. Like,
the mind games are weird, and I don't love making decisions that are like negative decisions. I'm not making a decision about what I want to play and what I want to see in my deck. I'm making decisions about what I actively don't want to be playing against.
You're like, I'm the aggro deck, and I'm just burning all of the board wipes, regardless of color or whatever.
Or there's the meta game of like, maybe I should be burning all the cards in my own color in the first couple picks, so that I can, again, try and send that signal. I think that's probably, in a lot of cases, a pretty reasonable strategy.
I think that works in 2-player burn draft. I wouldn't attempt that in 4-player burn draft, though. At that point, I think you're just hurting yourself.
It's just like, I am making fewer decisions that I think are fun in those cases. So.
Yeah. But I think pack size is the first thing that we have the freedom to adjust that Wizards of the Coast does not. And so I would encourage you to solve the packs wheeling around the table problem just with more smaller packs, which also has the upside. And again, this is kind of an illusion, but you get more first picks because there's more packs.
That's true.
Which
your first picks are worse, but
there's more of them.
There's more of them.
Yeah. Which is something. I don't know. I mean, some people feel good about that.
So what's your favorite way if that's not ideal for you?
The way that I do now all the time, basically, is Housman Draft, 4-player Housman Draft. This is a draft designed for 2 players that pretty easily scales up to 4. And there was actually a couple weeks ago at our Cube Night, the rare 4-player pod, just because we could actually normally we try and end up at some combination of 8s and 6s if we can, which is almost always possible. But in this case, we had already made some packs for some cubes, and somebody was already told they were going to play with 6 players, and so they put their packs away. And we ended up with the 4 pod, which is...
We did a bad job. We could do better next
time.
It's fine.
We're learning, we're growing. We ended up with a 4 pod, and none of these players had ever done this draft format before. And I was like, look, I can walk you through the first pick and a half, and I guarantee you'll get this, and it'll be fun. And so I talked them through it. And here's what you do. Every player starts with 45 random cards from the cube. just in front of them in a pile. You can consider that 3 booster packs if you want. That's what that is effectively. But 45 cards shuffled together, in a pile in front of each player. Then you take 9 cards from the remainder of the cube, so not the packs in front of each player, deal them out face up on the table. Then you each draw a 5-card hand from your 45-card pool, and you go around the table in order, each exchanging a card from your hand with a card on the table face up. So I put down this card I don't want. Everyone sees I don't want it. I pick up a card that everyone saw me take face up that's now in my draft pool. And you make 3 exchanges for the 5-card hands. So you're stuck with 2 of the cards you opened every time no matter what. And then those 5 cards become part of your draft pool. And then you take the cards that are left on the table and you burn them. And you repeat that process and do it over and over again until the draft is over.
I do think it's worth pointing out that that was a lot more difficult to explain, and probably a lot of people did not pick up on it as easily as pick 2 cards at a time.
Which is why Wizards of the Coast can't do something like this. It's hard to explain, but I spent 90 seconds.
Once you do it, it's very clear.
And it's so clear once you do it, and I have seen it, that it's not hard. You're not going to mess it up, I don't think. It's pretty easy to get it right.
Yeah, and we also have this written up in a detailed explainer, which we'll link to in the show notes.
Yeah, we have all these formats written up on the website, and so check out our database of different draft formats, because one thing we are big champions of is you can play Cube with any number of players. We have both done a million 2-player drafts in our time and had a great time doing it. Honestly, 2-player Cube is still, frankly, maybe my favorite way to play. And we've also drafted pods with 40-plus people in them for the holidays. So any number...
Yeah, we got to start playing the holiday draft.
Any number in between there can totally work. So yeah, it's way hard to explain, but the really nice thing about this draft format, there's a couple really nice things about it. One, you still have draft signals because there's face-up information. I saw you put down this medium good red card on our 5th pick. I assume you're not playing red. I've seen you pick multiple blue cards. I assume you're playing some combination of blue. And we also usually play, this is informal, but I usually like to play that every card that you've seen publicly that I drafted, I just keep face up in front of me. So you don't have to take notes of which cards I took. You'll just see that, oh, these are the cards you saw me take publicly. You can kind of see roughly what colors I'm drafting. But you don't get the whole picture because the best cards in your hand, you kept to yourself. So they're getting information about the sort of long tail of playables in your deck, but not the cards that are directing your strategy or your biggest bombs, because those were just in your opening hand and never got put down on the table and no one ever got to see them. And so you have this little secret information that your opponents don't know, and it's a really nice amount of face up and face down information, I think, for a smaller draft like that. Kind of like how reading the signals at a 4-player table with just pure hidden information is kind of occluded or maybe too obvious, or it just feels kind of weird. I like that amount of hidden versus public information for a 4-player draft. And I think it also really contributes to a fun, casual vibe, because you can see face up oh, there's the aggro player. Everyone make sure you have a plan for so-and-so's aggro deck, because look, we can see all the 1-drops that, they took. It makes it, I think, a little more fun and casual. The biggest thing by far, though, is that you have a huge chunk of cards that no one is going to play, right? You get access to the best cards you want out of whatever, I guess it's 88, because it's 9 packs of 5. Yeah, there's 88 other fresh cards from the cube that are not in the 45 card packs that you're each dealt out. And you get your pick of the best cards from those 88 additional cards. And then the ones you don't want, or the ones you didn't want from your pool you put back down on the table, just get discarded away. And that sort of introduction of way more cards available in the pool means that you can draft focus strategy. You can just draft a dedicated red-white aggro deck, because there just be 3 color pairs, no one's playing, and those cards just continue to get discarded and ignored. And you're going to see way more cards for your deck than you would otherwise see at a typical pick 2 table.
Which I think also makes sense if you have a cube that you're used to playing with 8 players and you kind of have expectations about what the fastest deck is going to look like or how many cards you need to make a certain strategy work. It ends up feeling fairly similar to that.
Yeah, I think a lot of these draft formats are basically designed to try and make 4-player draft decks or 2-player draft decks as similar as possible to an 8-player draft deck, because that is the normal that most cube designers are imagining and designing towards.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that Housman Draft is a lot of fun. It is sort of that nice balance of some public information, but still enough hidden information that you're not just playing this perfect information game where you have to try and understand everything if you want to optimally. The
one thing I will say specifically about 4-player Housman, and this is getting in the weeds a little bit, but I think it is technically not super balanced with 45 card pools, because one player gets to pick first 3 times and everyone else got to pick first twice. So I might just suggest, if you're worried about that, make him packs of 42. And
that sounds pretty fixable by tweaking some numbers a bit.
It's also, frankly, I don't think a problem at all. I don't think that additional sort of first pick, which everyone gets picked out of that pool, right? You get one card from it before everyone else does. The amount that's going to have like an impact on the win percentage of your deck is so vanishingly small that I cannot imagine ever feeling like it's way smaller than the advantage of going first in a game of Magic, right? Like if you just roll to see who gets to go first in the Housman Draft, then it's way smaller sort of impact on the overall outcomes than rolling to see who gets to go first in a game of Magic. So I don't think it's actually a problem, but if you are a obsessive little freak, you might think to yourself, well, wait a minute, but with 45 card packs, yeah, that's true. You can also just make it 8 hands of 5 instead of 9 hands of 5 if you want everyone to go first twice.
Yeah, I mean, you can even balance it by saying whoever wins the die roll for picking first in the draft, they lose the die roll for their first match.
Which, well, yeah, would be much worse. I would just choose to not win the die roll then. I don't know.
Well, then the low roll.
If you win the die roll to go first in the Houseman, you get to choose if you want to go first in the Houseman or if you want to roll to go first in your first game of Magic.
Yeah, this is important. We got to hash this out.
I want to mention another way I do like to draft with 4 players. 2 other ways I like to draft with 4 players that I'll mention here. One is grid drafting, which, frankly, I love grid drafting. It's probably the way of doing 2 and 4 player drafts I've done the most in my life because I was exposed to it before I learned Houseman. But it's similar enough to Houseman, and now that I know Houseman, I think Houseman is actually a little bit better. Grid draft, basically, you don't start with a hand, so there's no hidden information that your opponents don't see. It's fully open information draft format. But your picks are constrained in that cards are presented to you in a 3x3 grid face up, and you have to take a row or a column. And when you're doing it with 4 players, you just make it 3x3 grid, player 1 picks, you replace the cards they took with a new column or row. Player 2 picks, you replace those cards again. Player 3 picks, and then player 4 chooses from the remainder. They don't get a fresh row or column for their last pick. So again, you might want to balance the number of first picks here because the number of last picks is relevant for that feature. It's a way to basically, again, show you more cards, but constrain your decisions so that it's not intellectually overwhelming to decide what you're going to pick. You have to pick a row or a column. So you're going to get some incidental picks, but you are going to have a much bigger pool you're drafting from, so you're going to have that same opportunity to draft a focus deck if you want. I think much less so than in Houseman, though. I think on average, grid draft decks, because you have literally incidental picks, cards you didn't intend to pick, end up in your pool, you're more likely to be rewarded for doing some kind of soupy nonsense. But that is another way to draft with 4 players. I've done a lot, and I think is preferable to pick 2 draft, but probably if I had to choose, I would always choose Houseman over grid draft these days.
I still really enjoy grid drafting, especially with 2 players. I think I might like it a little bit more than Houseman. It is a very different type of decision that you're making, but I appreciate that it is much easier to explain, especially if you're there drafting. You just sit down, lay out 9 cards, and tell your opponent, would you like a row or a column? That's your choice.
I will do it with 2 players a lot, especially if I'm playing with somebody that is a little less enfranchised and newer to the game or completely new to the Cube drafting. Because it is all face up, you can say hey, I see you not looking at that card in your colors, but I think you actually really should be looking at that card in your colors. And you can even do it in a way that it doesn't even sound like you're trying to help them. I'll sometimes
just
be
oh, there's a Ragavan. That's whoa.
Well, or what I'll do is I'll be oh, dang, if you take that column, you're gonna cut me from this card while also getting cards for your deck. You can just kind of be oh, drat, you're gonna take that column because it's so good, and then you're secretly telling them you should take that column because it's good for you.
I do like that aspect though of hate drafting a little bit. It is a 0-sum game, and so maximizing. Okay, well, if I take this row,
1v1 cube drafting is a 0-sum game. Yes,
I get this one card that's really good for my deck, and I get to hate something, and I get a neutral pick. Those are really fun decisions, I think, personally. I don't know why I feel differently about that than burning cards. Maybe it's just because I'm just throwing cards away in the void rather than choosing to actively take a card that I don't have to play against immediately.
Well, I think the cost is usually much higher in grid draft. Because, you get free burns, and burn draft, you get to burn cards. That's just what you get to do. So you can just pick whatever card you don't want to play against and burn it. Whereas in grid draft, sometimes you'll get that ideal row where it's oh, sick, 2 great playables for me, and smack dab in the middle is that board wipe. It's going to be really good against me in your colors. That just feels like a cool piece of variance that you get rewarded for. Whereas you can't just for free burn every board wipe, right? There's going to be a lot of picks where it's oh, there's the board wipe down there in the corner, but this other column is incredible for me, so I'm just going to let you have it, right? That's going to happen sometimes too. Those decisions are fun. The last way I want to mention is perhaps the most deranged way to draft that
don't do this unless you're a bunch of sickos.
Anyone's ever conceived. This was inspired directly by Ryan Spain's draft format that he invented to basically play 4-player drafts with his friends of a retail limited set. And it's very similar to Pick 2. It basically is Pick 2, except you draft 6 packs and 2 decks. So you have a giant pool, you get a bunch of cards for your decks, and then you build 2 decks from your pool. And this, even more so, I think, is a way of drafting that completely throws signals out the door because if you're playing two color decks, you're playing all but one color between your two decks, which means you can take basically any card out of any pack. If you just are willing to splash that 5th color in either of your decks, you can literally take any power outlier that you open at all times, which...
Wait, sorry, so step back. You're just describing you're taking 2 picks and then you're building 2 separate decks, but with a combined pool?
Yes, that is Ryan Spain's...
That's Ryan's... Okay, got it.
Yes. This is the draft method that Marshall and LSV talked about on Limited Resources ages ago. And honestly, I think it's cool and interesting. I think it has the upside of everyone's deck is crazy powerful because you get to have a huge pool that you're building your deck from. You get to like move cards between decks whenever you want. I think it has the downside of the actual draft itself being a pure test of card evaluation and not at all an evaluation of like figuring out what's quote unquote open at the table because you can take cards in every color.
I will take a stronger stance here and say I really don't love drafting a combined pool. I have. I remember doing this a couple times. I'm sure I've done it with cubes as well, but when Battle Bond came out and there was
that
a similar...
basically the Battle Bond draft format,
you pick 2 cards at a time or each...
And then you and your teammate would build decks from the pool,
And it really was just like, okay, well, we'll have a 2-color deck and a 3-color deck. Any color is playable, so we just take the best cards out of every single pack. Yeah, I think after the second draft of that, it was like, I'd rather play sealed with this format because this is not that fun.
So, I mean, that's a way to do things that works, and the idea here is that, like, we're drafting the same number of cards that we would draft at an 8-player table because we're going to draft 6 packs, and we're each drafting 2 decks. 4 players each have 2 decks. That's still 8 decks. So I think the idea that Ryan Spain was getting to was, like, this is, you know, the best way we can, like, mimic Retail Limited with just 4 players, which I don't fully agree with that because I came up with a much more deranged way to do this, which is if you still open 6 packs, one at a time, and basically draft where every pick you alternate whether you're drafting for deck A or deck B. You have to choose, like, this pack, I can only take a card for deck A. I'm not drafting one mega pool. I'm drafting 2 separate pools for 2 separate decks in real time.
Very difficult logistics. You got to do this with people you trust.
Well, so, I mean, I think the logistics are fine. I think it's way more mentally taxing than it is logistically complicated. But
it's both.
Anyway, basically, if you imagine that this is how your draft works, you are alternating between deck A, deck B over and over again repeatedly. You can basically draft 2 different seats at the table. I devised a little way of doing this that I call Wimbledon Draft. It's a dumb name. Who cares? But the idea is you're going back and forth like while you're watching a tennis match between deck A, deck B.
Huh.
It's also, there's a lot of draft formats and like mulligans named after places, so it felt like it kind of fit. Anyway, here's the deal. You basically insert into the draft a pack of just basic lands from the cube. You each start with a pack, and then in between some set of you put a 5th pack of just basic lands.
So it's important you have an odd number of packs.
Yes.
Assuming you have an even number of players.
This only works with 4 players. This format doesn't work with any other number of players. This is specifically meant for 4 players when you each want to draft a seat at the table. And if you put that basic land pack into the draft, basically, and then when you see the basic land pack, you just pick for whatever deck you're supposed to pick for. That is your pick for deck B. You're basically skipping a pick for deck B. That effectively has the impact of offsetting the draft so that you end up drafting 2 decks that are across the table from each other at an 8-player table. Whereas if you don't do that, you're not actually drafting an 8-player table. You're drafting at 2 4-player tables that are separate.
Right.
Because you're always seeing the same pack. Like deck A wheels the same pack for itself, basically.
Right. So this forces them to cross, so you end up...
This crosses them, basically. It feels a little weird the first couple times. You're like, okay, now I get a basic land for this deck. What's that all about?
Doesn't matter. It just makes the mechanics go smooth.
You have to have a pack there. Otherwise, it's really hard to keep track of this. Every cube has basic lands that are sleeved up in the same sleeve, so it's really easy to do this. And what you do in this draft format is you are drafting 2 separate decks, and then what I really like about Ryan Spain's format, which I think is really cool, is the fact that you then play your matches, not like my deck A plays your deck A in a best of 3 match. When you are paired against a player, you play each of your deck A's first, then you play each of your deck B's in game 2, and then if you make it to game 3, you each secretly choose for your opponent which of the decks they have to play. And this is the only redeeming quality, I think, of the draft a mega pool and build 2 decks approach, because there's a really interesting question of which deck do I make better and how do I distribute power? Do I try and have like one really good deck that I think is going to win almost all the time and like one deck that can like steal some wins here and there but is a lot less reliable? Or do I like aim for decks that are equal power level, so like it's near impossible to tell which one's better or worse? I think that's really cool, and the fact that if you end up in the 3rd game of a match, it's so interesting to be like, all right, well, I think that's your worst deck, but is it worse against what I think you think my worst deck is? Like, it's a really interesting way to kind of secretly make that decision. I really like this way of playing Magic if you have 3 other people that are willing to think, frankly, very hard about their draft picks. This is the draft format that takes as long as an 8-player draft, for sure. maybe even a little longer.
Maybe longer. I would say definitely longer.
It basically is an 8-player draft. The big difference is that you are drafting 6 packs because there's only 4 players, so you can't open 8 packs at a time. You
could, though.
That would be way too hard logistically to have multiple zones to keep track of. I think that's a mistake.
Extreme zone drafting.
I think that's a mistake.
So many zones are required.
And because you're effectively opposite the table from yourself, you can't wheel cards to yourself or pass cards to yourself intentionally. But the resulting decks, in my experience, are indistinguishable from 8-player draft decks. They are basically exactly the same, which is a huge benefit if you as a cube designer are trying to test out how archetypes work in your cube and you're imagining an 8-player draft as the sort of paradigm, the sort of perfect draft you're sort of designing everything around. I actually really love the match model. I love that I have 2 decks, and if I don't like one of my decks, I only have to play it half the night, right? We've all had a draft night where you draft a deck and you're like, well, this is kind of a train wreck. I didn't have the best draft. Now I got to go play for 2.5 hours with this deck that I don't like. That never happens in this draft format because, I guess it could theoretically happen if you draft 2 train wrecks.
Decks you don't like.
If you draft 2 train wrecks, I can't help you. You're beyond help.
I don't know. It seems likely because your brain is trying to keep track of 2 decks at once. Seems very easy.
But yeah, if you're willing to do that mental leap of trying to keep track of 2 decks at once, I think this is a very cool way to draft. And this way would also, for what it's worth, work with booster packs. You would just have to each bring 6 to the table.
That's a good point.
Which is expensive. And so if you're willing to bring 6 booster packs to the table, you could do this instead of pick 2 draft with a regular retail limited set, but you're just paying 2 persons draft buy-ins, basically.
Right, and a couple points of psychic damage.
I don't think it's that bad. I think you're overstating it. I don't want to push people away. I think it is an ambitious...
That's a good word for it.
It's an ambitious draft format that I find to be really fun, and I wish I could get people to do with me more regularly. But the problem is that if anybody's never done it before, people like you were like, don't do it, it's going to kill you. So...
Look, I've seen some people who didn't get warned, and they came out looking pretty rough.
It can be just a lot of decisions. I love the match format of having 2 decks and getting to choose my opponent's deck for match 3 if we get there. I think it creates a lot of really interesting little decisions. For what it's worth, really small tip here. To make that secret decision, just give your opponent a representative card from each of your decks that you saw in the games, and then have them put it face down which one they want to play against. That's the easy way to make that decision secret and asynchronous, so you can both reveal at the same time.
Makes sense.
So let's close here, Anthony, with... If you are, after all of that talk about potentially other better draft formats for 4 players, if you have access to changing pack sizes and a bigger cube of cards to draw from, if you're going to ignore that and you really want to design a pick 2 draft format, what would you do specifically if you were looking to design a format that was meant to be drafted in this way?
I think the fact that you're playing with 4 players still just has a bigger impact than the double picks. Maybe you have some ideas, but I would sort of think about that small player group and how that impacts the draft. And like we already talked about a bunch, I think tuning down gold cards is a great choice. I think that focusing on the monocolors is a great choice. Hybrid can help just make a lot of cards more flexible and more available if there are hybrid cards that make sense. I think also, if you're only expecting to play with 4 players, you can start with just 180 cards, is much more approachable and much easier to put together, and you can always just start adding more cards slowly over time if your play group grows.
Well, if you're designing for pick 2, that's exactly what you would do, right? That's the whole point.
Right. That's a good point. So yeah, start small. I guess another question I wonder about a smaller group draft is, do you want as big power outliers? I feel like not so much because you're going to end up just seeing them more often because you're going to be playing fewer rounds with a smaller pool of cards. So if there's some really big power outliers, especially things that are going to take over and dominate a game, you maybe don't want to see those game in game out, and you don't have as much variance between just playing with 7 other opponents. So I might be cognizant of that, and maybe more just willing to be if you've seen a card enough, just cut it, and you don't have to worry that much up front about that. I don't know. What else would you change?
I completely agree with everything you said. I would go fully no gold cards to start.
No gold cards. That is extreme.
You say it's extreme, but it's how Magic was for a while before they invented gold cards.
That's a good point. And then they decided to make a 7-mana 4/5.
I think this is exactly. Yeah, they made a 9-mana 3/4 with Rampage 2. Rampage got to be one of the worst mechanics of all time. Not really talked about as one of the worst mechanics of all time, but truly awful. The one that every creature beyond the first that blocks this, it gets this benefit. It's just that's a really weird way to write, don't double block this creature.
Menace.
It's like the opposite of menace. It's like you have to single block it. You can't double block it.
Not a lot of cards with Rampage, huh?
No, it's because they're terrible. It's a terrible mechanic.
I've beaten Varchild's War Riders more times
than I can.
That's
the only interesting one with Rampage, because it has trample and it gives your opponents blockers that are no good against it. That is the only card that's cool with Rampage. I would just start with no gold cards. I honestly think that this is a cool exercise for any cube design. Gold cards are a bit of a third rail in that they are a really quick way that your cube can end up in a place you didn't intend because of their impacts on the draft and deck building in your environment. And so I honestly think it's a good suggestion if you're designing any cube, just to like build the whole cube out with no gold cards and play test it a couple times on Cube Cobra and see how it feels. I think for this draft format especially, I would be really inclined to build a cube with 0 gold cards whatsoever. So the signals are not, here's the 2-color card that I still see in the pack. It is instead what colors actually feel like they're not being paid attention to, or is it red aggressive cards specifically I see that is open? Like, it gives you more opportunity to actually read signals in a more deep and nuanced way. I agree with the power outlier thing, and I would say it's not just about power, it's about game impact, right?
Yeah, I mean, you're not going to notice, like, Brainstorm was super good this game, and I'm so tired of losing to Brainstorm. You're not going to notice that so much, but you will notice...
Lightning Bolt might be a power outlier, but it's not going to, like, make every game about Lightning Bolt. As opposed to a card, like, one of the classic, old school vintage cube examples for me is Opposition, where it's like, do you want 1/4 of your players every time you draft your cube to have an opposition deck? Is that really what you want? Like twice as many opposition decks as at a regular 8-player table?
That's a good example because it both makes the whole game about itself and also does not end the game quickly. So you're going to have a lot of that opposition gameplay happening.
Yes, I would think much more critically about those types of power outliers, the ones that, I mean, maybe opposition doesn't even have a better win rate. Maybe it's kind of a trap, but it still, does the thing in 40% of the games, which can still have a like negative impact on the overall draft night. So I think about those kinds of cards that have that kind of impact and be sort of hesitant of them. I would also be a little hesitant about the nature of answers. If you have a bunch of like potent sideboard cards in a cube like this and you're doing double picks, I think it becomes kind of free maybe to be like, okay, well, here's a card from my deck and I'll just grab this Tormod script or whatever because maybe I'll want it out of the sideboard. A card that you would never prioritize in a regular draft and be only 1/8 likely to end up with. Here, you'll probably pretty often have a pick where it's like, okay, I can afford to take this for free and still get a playable card in one of my colors as well. And I think that means that those kinds of answers are maybe more likely to just end up hosing players. And, I think different cubes have different textures and demands on those kinds of answers. Those kinds of answers I think are very appropriate for certain types of cubes. I guess what I'm really saying is like the type of cube where you want Tormod Script to be a card and be like balanced and good is maybe not the kind of cube that makes a lot of sense to draft with 4 players.
I wonder if also just more broadly kind of like silver bullet single card answers that just neutralize a particular kind of deck can be the same kind of like punishing power outlier like opposition can be, where it's just you're much more likely to face the player that has that one
Twice
silver bullet.
Likely, yeah, exactly. That's maybe a better way to say what I'm trying to get at, right? Like if you have a Tormod Script in your regular cube and you have a 1 Reanimator player, then their chances are 3 in 7 that they get to actually play one of the people that has that Tormod Script. Versus if you're playing a full 3 rounds, you're literally playing every opponent. So you're going to play against a Tormod Script at some point, guaranteed. So a consideration there for sure.
I think a question players will ask is probably about combos, because it seems like when you're taking 2 picks, is it like, are combos better? Because if I see them both in the same pack, I get to take it right away. I kind of don't feel like the double picks really has that much of an impact, because it matters specifically if a 2-card combo ends up in one single pack.
We could crunch some Hyper Geos and see how likely that is.
I don't think it's that much likely, and it just means it's potentially more visible to a player that will see those 2 cards together and be like, oh, this is a thing that's in this cube.
I guess it's actually not that hard, right? Like, if you have 12 packs, it's just 1 in 12 that any given 2-card combo is in the same pack, right? Because Splinter Twin's always in a pack, and so the question is just, what are the chances Deceiver Exarch is in the pack with Splinter Twin? And the answer is 1 in 12, right?
Sure. I think that...
Because the Splinter Twin is one of the cards.
Twin is one
very,
of the
very slightly less
I
than 1
wish
in 12.
I was better at statistics. It's one of my big flaws as a person.
I think you're right that people are going to be wondering, like, is that a thing you can, do here? If you should, like, people take their Splinter Twin Deceiver Exarch, take their Farmstead Gleaner and their Pathway Arrows or their Oketros Monument and their White Main Line all at once. I think that's a vibes question for you. I think, like, there's going to be 1 in 12 chance that any given, like, AB combo is going to be just in a pack alone and people can just take it. And the question is like, okay, is that a colorless combo like Farmstead Gleaner Pathway Arrows? Again, only in the Turbo Cube, where literally any deck that hits that 1 in 12 coin flip can just take it and put it in their deck. Is it a Deceiver Exarch Splinter Twin where they're across 2 different colors, and so even if you do open that 1 in 12 coin flip, you are in pack 2 and you have a green-white deck right now, and so you just can't take any of those cards, and then you just hate draft one of them so you don't hand the combo to the player you're passing to? Like, I don't think there's any objective game design implications for how double picks really affects those kinds of combos. It's truly just a matter of what you as a designer want. And I think a lot of designers out there know if they're the kind of cube designer that wants to have AB combos in their cube or not. And I think double picks honestly barely has an impact on that.
I think I agree. And just to be clear, we are talking about just doing like shuffled up, fully randomized packs, which I think is relevant if you're trying to collate packs in some way. I'm just thinking about the Battle Bond set we mentioned, where the packs were deliberately seeded with pairs of cards that worked really well together. And so you were always just taking those. Those cards were also all busted, and like they drew you the other cards.
Yeah, they drew the other one. Yeah, it's basically like a conspiracy, kind of.
But yeah, I think that, like, sure, if you're doing combos in that kind of sense where you have specific cards that reference each other or go well together and you're collating them in packs together, sure, that's going to have a big impact, but most people are not going to be doing that.
Yeah, also just don't do that. Don't do that. I mean, look, if you want to ignore me and do it, then fine, but if you're wondering, should I do that? You shouldn't. Don't do that.
The people that know they want to do it will not listen to you, so
exactly.
You can just say don't do it.
You say don't do it, yeah. This is my advice always for people that want to start their own business. I'd say don't. And then I would say, if you want to ignore me, you can, but don't.
You'll have to say that second part.
I told you we had a whole episode about this. This is already over an hour, and I think we can honestly keep going. But yeah, I think in summary, Pick 2 Draft makes a lot of sense for Wizards of the Coast selling booster packs to try and make a more accessible draft format. And overall, I am thrilled and really hope this opens more people up to the idea of a draft with 4 players not being less than or invalid or a compromise, but just being a different, completely valid, awesome way to play Magic. I'm also a little worried because I do think that Pick 2 Draft is, from a game design perspective, not ideal for all the reasons we talked about. And if you are drawn to making a 4-player cube, I would strongly encourage you to check out specifically Housman Drafting, or just, like you said, Anthony, a smaller, more numerous pack size that includes burning the last couple cards out of a pack. That's like maybe a simpler way if you don't want to like dramatically recontextualize what a draft is for your players.
And considering how you're going to explain it to the other players you're going to play with is important, I think.
It's really important, yeah. If you think that as soon as you start explaining a Housman Draft, your players are going to be like, we're just going to go play Commander, like we're not going to do any of this, then yeah.
Don't let that happen.
Whatever you do, do not let them go play Commander under any circumstances. So if you have to bait them there with a like draft that seems superficially similar enough to a regular draft, then I think starting with smaller pack sizes or just burning the last bits of packs so that you can see more cards. What we really want to do is just let people see more cards and choose not to draft a big chunk of them to make sure their decks can actually be somewhat focused. And if you are going to design a cube like this, I think our biggest recommendation is like limit your power outliers, really harshly limit your gold cards, and think about what answers look like, because you are going to play against every deck at the table if you're playing a full 3 rounds and you're only playing with 4 players. And I think that's how you should plan to do it. Like, you could theoretically be like, we play 2 rounds and that determines a winner. I think you should just plan to play everybody. Don't care about like playing winners. Just play every opponent.
Yeah, if time permits. I mean, a round robin is a fun way to play. And I think that, I'm just so used to that, like 3 rounds of cube makes a cube night. So for me, that fits perfectly. But I mean, it depends on where your expectations are.
This is why I love 2-player cube, though, because you just play 1 match and then you draft again. And so in the same amount of time...
More drafting, less games.
Yeah, well, in the same amount of time, you would have done like a regular cube night with 8 players, and you would have spent, cumulatively 45 minutes waiting for other rounds to end and just kind of like dirtling around. You've actually just done 3 whole drafts with your 1 opponent in that same time, which is a thrill. So here's to hoping this gets more people interested in drafting with fewer than 8 players, because even in that episode of Good Luck High Five you referenced, they mentioned a couple times like, you can't draft with 8. It's like impossible to get 8 people together, so you just can't draft.
That made me so sad.
And I'm like, but first of all,
you can do it. You actually can get 8 people together.
First of all, you can get 8 if you actually try.
It takes some work.
Second of all, even if you don't, you can still just draft. It's okay. It still counts. And Maria be like, maybe I can actually draft now because 4 is attainable. It's like, you could always have done that.
Yeah.
You could draft with 2 people. You get 2 people together, just draft. It's great. Anyway.
New tagline for the show. Lucky paper. It's okay.
It's okay.
That could be read differently, but
the things in the world are actually not okay, but we're telling you it's okay. On that bombshell, that is the end of this episode of Lucky Paper Radio. Thank you all so much for tuning in. The music for this show is produced by DJ James Nasty, and the show is edited by Matthew. All the Magic cards are produced by Wizards of the Coast, and this podcast is produced by thinking really hard about Magic cards and speaking to microphones about it. If you want to support what we do here, we have a Patreon where you can subscribe and get access to a bonus feed where Anthony and I talk about whatever we want, as long as it has absolutely nothing to do with Magic. That's our podcast, Magic Doesn't Exist. And check out the Cube Fellowship, which is our new initiative where we are helping support the best and brightest in the Cube community and making sure that these grassroots Cube events that are so resurgent, what's the word for on the come up? So
powerful.
These local grassroots Cube events that are so powerful We're trying to make sure that they are full of the best and brightest the Cube community has to offer. So check out luckypaper.co for all of that. All the links are going to be in the show notes. Anthony, thank you for the gift of friendship and for the gift of Cube.
Thank you for this podcast and for an almost flawless job on that outro.